today is a very special day, even though we consider that every day has been special in this campus of excellence. This is a special day because it is intense concerning the content and the people who accompany us. Because besides they have very busy agendas and they have made some time in order to come and be here with us. So I particularly thank them for having come. I would like, before we begin and giving the floor to begin the day, to mention Adán Martín, who was president of the government of the Canary Islands, and who is the person thanks to whom the campus exists, because he was the first who in the year 2005 believed that this was possible. So therefore the campus of excellence exists because he was the one who wanted it to be so. So I wish to thank him publicly for this. And the second thing is to explain to you how we are going to proceed with the day. First, we have the session on the world situation from the economic, social, and political perspective. Then we will speak after the pause of immigration, the challenges, problems, and solutions. And afterwards, there was an extraordinary lecture from the President of Mexico, Felipe Calderón, which has been cancelled for the usual reasons of agenda of the heads of states. You never know until the day before. And it happened as it happened in the Canary Islands at 6 hours. Previously, they cancelled it, but I'm not going to be harmed by this because we have our friend Balbir Matur, the one that you wanted to hear to the other day, who is going to make some very curious reflections in a totally different format, which is going to be a dialogue and exchange between him and Manuel Carballo. They will jointly have a curious discussion, and I think you're going to enjoy this. And in the afternoon, we have the session on world economy, challenges and risks, and I believe it will be fascinating. I hope you will enjoy it, and I hope you will enjoy the day. And I profit from this opportunity to thank all our guests of the day for the kindness they have had in sharing with us this Campus of Excellence 2009. So without further ado, I give the floor to Pérez, the moderator, who was talked into this a few days ago. Thank you very much, Antonio.
Bueno, resulta un poco sorprendente que en realidad.
It is somewhat surprising that the only one who should be introduced is the moderator, because all the others, you know them much better than you know me. We are in a panel of personalities of greatest relevance at an international level. So therefore, I am not going to speak at length of who's who, because they're perfectly well known in Spain and in the rest of the world. To my right, we have Michel Rocard, who was Prime Minister of France. He is a person who has been in politics for a long time. He was Minister of Planning and Development, Agriculture, and he continues active in politics. He is a member of the European Parliament at present. And to my left, we have the one who for me was the author of the Irish Miracle. Ireland, when he started to participate in the government, was one of the most delayed countries, and he was the one who was the visible face of what was the great Irish takeoff. He was Minister of Finances and Industry, and he reached the government with a coalition of the Labour Party and the Democratic Left. And result of this was a tremendous Irish miracle. And I also introduced to you the only woman we have today. We are not parity, But this will be fixed because José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero will come and set the parity to rights. But anyway, she is here for her own merit. She is Rosalía Artega, former president of Ecuador. And she is a journalist, by the way. We were talking before. She most beautiful cities of the continent, and we have common hobbies as journalists and as travelers. She was extremely relevant in the Ecuadorian political life. She was vice president of the government and president when he was overthrown. But she is a person who's very much loved by the Ecuadorian population and who played a very important role in trying to make her country at the time more peaceful. And finally, I present the only Spaniard, along with myself, in this panel, who's Adán Martín. He is the president of the government of the Canary Islands, perfectly well known in Spain, member of Coalición Canaria. He was born in Santa Cruz de Tenerife, where he was first mayor and then vice president and president of the Cabildo, and then president of the Canary Islands in the previous term. And I am going to ask all of them in one first intervention to be brief, and we are going to begin, if you like, by a brief presentation, because if this panel has some sense today, I think it has sense always, but today, 2008 and 2009, is when we have realized, unfortunately, to what extent the world is one global village, and we're all immersed in it. And this world situation, from the political, economic, and social perspectives, mostly of the year 2008 and 2009, the expression economy and crisis has hit all of us equally, I would say, or each of them with our own specific elements, but we have all suffered it, from the wealthiest countries in the European Union to the developing countries. And I believe it is most timely that we use this term. And I am convinced that the people who are here with us will give us new ideas. Mr. Rocard, you now have the floor. Thank you very much. Everybody understands. Well, you have translation. Can you hear me through the translation? All right. It looks like it is working. As has just been said by our moderator, we are undergoing a difficult period, and we are witnessing a long crisis. But in this sequence of crises, of which we have not yet come out, there are more or less serious periods, and periods where there seems to be a consensus towards a way out, and other problems are solved. And it seems to me that today, since last summer, we are now in a difficult period in this crisis, and I would like to tell you why. There seems to be a conjunction of disasters which makes the landscape worse. We see with our own eyes, little by little, that the hope of peace in the Middle East is disappearing. The peace that the creation of a Palestinian state will allow for a balanced reconciliation between two communities, and this seems to be fading away. And we are arriving at a crisis without a leader, a crisis where the religious aspects are essential, And we see why this has lasted for 1 century, and this is one first element that aggravates things. These feelings of getting worse in international relations. And second, about the meeting in Copenhagen, in order to fight in favor of the planet, to fight against the threats of global warming, this might really fail. But most of the ministers of foreign affairs consider it is highly probable that it will fail. And if we do not manage to mobilize humanity rapidly in view of these threats, the planet will be converted into a frying pan, and the grandchildren of our grandchildren will not be able to live in it. And in order to avoid this, everybody knows that we will require enormous efforts, and more enormous and difficult, because we have started late. And this is what makes it more serious. So this meeting in Copenhagen doesn't have to very good auspices. Nuclear proliferation, the third problem. If Northern Korea is giving signs of calm, it seems that the negotiations have not done too badly, but Iran, on the contrary, doesn't lead us to hope for anything and to diminish our fears. And it doesn't allow us to see an international solution adopted by Iran. So we are considering the arrival of these nuclear weapons in the hands of integrist Islamists, and see what will happen. The fourth element of difficulty is that we all have, probably also the Spaniards, and the Irish, I'm quite sure, and the French, we have all applauded and we have rejoiced because when there was a new American president chosen, he was the symbol of progress. He said many things. He said particularly, and he wanted to put an end to the era of North American unilateralism. President Bush decided for the world only considering the American interests. And now there was the hope that finally we could have multilateral negotiations, and in this way we could solve the global warming, the Middle East, the nuclear proliferation. And Obama is in extreme difficulty, and now he doesn't have enough strength in this legislature in order to create this universal health insurance. It is the last civilized country that doesn't have it. Spain, France, Italy, they all have it. But the United States still doesn't have it. It is really a scandal for their civilization. And in order to achieve this, President Obama would need to be reinforced by a great success abroad. And Iran has not really taken the hand that he offered them. Israel refuses to execute their demands for peace, the demand of stopping this dangerous movement of new colonization in the occupied territories. And the failure of this president is really a great aggravation of the opportunities we have for solving our difficulties. This is the context. So this is a semester where we are still in crisis, and what is even more serious is that I would like, and I don't know how we're going to follow the discussion, because there is a great deal of technical knowledge incorporated to this, I would simply like to say the following. We are living at present in a country of Europe and also in the United States in a period after the summer of 2009 of a kind of lie, of agreed lie that says, and is chaired by the President of the World Bank and supported by the world press, that has discussed the drama, and also by most of the governments, because this suits them. But this is not true. This is not true. So, at the beginning of the year 2008, this multi-form crisis undertook the form of bank failures. The most important was that of Lehman Brothers, and there were a dozen before and a dozen afterwards. And all these were allowed to fail. And this is what transmitted these problems for the interbanking loans, and therefore a slowing down of the activities of the bank for industry and agriculture, the non-financial activity, the real activity. So you are taxpayers, you have been courageous, and you are the ones who have saved the banks. And there is a commitment that has never before been seen in history. Particularly, the theory was that the markets self-balance themselves, that all balance of a market is optimal and that it should not be touched. And if you wish to correct the environmental or social insufficiencies with a market balance, you have to use the taxes and the regulations for this, and there will be more losers than winners. And this was created by Milton Friedman in Chicago, who won the Nobel Prize, and they are the ones that led to this problem. And they announced that you should solve things on your own, on the private sector. And the heads of governments understood that the private sector only couldn't do anything, otherwise there would have been 20 million unemployed more. And it contributed to save the world banking sector. And these are not payments, but guarantees given for which represent 80% of the annual value of the GDP in North America. The figure is the same in Great Britain, 80% of the annual value of the GDP. And the guarantees, not complete disbursements, but for the European Union, as an average, there is a less astounding figure, but it is of 36% of the value of the GDP guaranteed by the banks. And how all these will be reimbursed is something we'll have to see later. But for the time being, the transmission of these bankruptcies has stopped thanks to the taxpayers. And therefore, our bank directors say, wonderful, we have been saved. Now we are going to be able to start again. We begin as before. Because the banking powers in the United States, as well as in the conference of the G20, and particularly in Great Britain, where it is more visible, is against the reform of the international banking system that would have been necessary due to the crisis. There will be as many derivatives in the products of the banks, and therefore the possibility of speculation on these products, and this is what explained the hunger due to the famines in Africa, because the derivatives dealt with wheat and milk, and they had a virtual money. And before all these crazy things took place, for a commercial dollar that circulated on the planet, there were imports, exports, services, purchases. One financial dollar had a reimbursement with shares and debentures. In 2006, a commercial dollar that circulated in the world for import, export, and services circulated between 80 and 90 financial dollars for each real dollar. So there was this virtual market that was created due to the exchange of promises for sale. And these were the derivatives. This was this product that led to all these problems with oil, but particularly wheat and milk. And this is going to continue. This is something that we will see again after we come out of the crisis. And on the other hand, unemployment is growing in all our countries, but this is not even under discussion. In all countries, the precarious work has reached a terrible level, between 15 and 25%. We have about 18% of the total of the active population of the country in the United States and Europe is precarious, unstable, or not permanent work, and we have many adults who are totally excluded from the labor market. They don't even have these precarious jobs, and this because the end of the banking crisis has not reconstituted the financial patrimony of the non-banking enterprises. And they have been really lost half their wealth because of the crisis, but this is difficult to present this in a balance. And on the other hand, the credit to companies and the shares have not really taken off, and so we are still in a crisis, and you still have for a few more years. But this is something that people don't speak about because it is not convenient, because the authorities have made an agreement on this balance of the financial system that cracked because of the excesses. And this is easy to agree upon, and the reasons why there is a regular and rapid growth without any financial crisis and full employment for all. United States, Europe, Australia, Canada, all the developed countries had full employment. This was marvelous. And these towards the year 75. And now why don't we know how to do this? We can only have half the growth that we did before. We are all in a situation of serious unemployment, deterioration of the labor market, and we have a great financial crisis every 4 or 5 years. If you remember the Asiatic crisis, the European crisis, the Russian crisis, the bubble of the I economy, and when they changed the capitalism, Australia, Brazil, Argentina have really led the rest of the continent, and this is going to continue. So you see how the heart of the matter is really the intellectual analysis of the reasons for this crisis. But since all the authorities that exist in the world of economy are authorities that have as a background 14 monetarist Nobel Prizes, Nobel Award winners, and they believed that the market could self-balance itself, and they believed that all balances of the market were optimal. You see that half of what is being told is false, and you will imagine what happens in the economy and what would happen in medicine if they suddenly discovered that Pasteur was wrong. And since Pasteur, we had been doing everything wrong. And it would really be terrible, because it would shatter what all the men and women have been doing. Economic sciences do not open the debate on the non-financial crisis, only on the banking sector. And the stagnation and the arrival of great precariousness to the labor markets. This, well, I could expand on this, but this is a global seminar, and I would like to give you a moderately optimistic message. Thank you very much, Mr. Rocard. I believe that you have stopped at a point which allows me to suggest Mr. John Bruton that he will contribute some expectations. And the question would be, do you think that the world has learned anything from this crisis, that Europe has learned anything, has learned its lesson, or the banks? As Mr. Rocard was saying, and then according to your experience in the government, could you give us a prospective view of the possible way out of the crisis?
I think we're only beginning to learn from the crisis. I think, truthfully, the crisis took all of the elites in the world almost completely by surprise. Very few people actually predicted what was going to happen. Even though the signs were quite obvious, we can see now. We can see, for example, that there was a major financial imbalance in the world, in that China was exporting too much, saving too much, spending too little. The United States and parts of Europe, on the other hand, were exporting too little, saving too little, and spending too much. And that, if you like, provided the seed capital, that gap, that additional money that the Chinese were spending, that provided the seed capital, which, as Michel has explained, was multiplied 90 times in the financial markets. And it created this huge bubble. What I think we've got to do now is focus on the essentials. One of the essentials is to have a banking system that people can trust. And that means, I think, separating investment banking from mainstream deposit-taking banking. And I think, for example, there should be an absolute ban imposed on deposit-taking institutions speculating in the markets with their own money. If people commission them to use their money to speculate with, someone else's money, that's okay. But the money of the bank should never be allowed to be speculated with, as it was in recent times and has led to the crisis. That should be simply made a criminal offence and banned. I think there is too much confidence in the idea that all-seeing regulators and comprehensive regulations will solve the problem. The idea that somehow or other, if you collect more and more information about what's happening, that some very wise central banker will be able to see the problem in good time and stop it. The truth of the matter is, even the wisest central banker is part of the herd. He's part of the society, and if the society is losing its bearings, central bankers lose their bearings too, because they're part of society. They're just human beings. And it doesn't matter how much information they get, they will not actually interpret the information correctly. If the mood is extremely optimistic, they will not see the signs that go against the mood. So that's why I'm not overly confident in the effectiveness of all of these proposals to have, new regulations for hedge funds, new regulations for rating agencies, new capital requirements for banks, new rules of disclosure for banks, we'll get a lot more information. But I question whether we will actually interpret it properly. And that's why I think that we need rules that are simple. We need to ban certain things. We need to say this is forbidden. And one example I have just given. I would like, without going through all of the things that Michel Rocard put forward, because I think he put a very good agenda in front of us all there, I would like to say that I think it's important to understand why we have problems in Copenhagen. The problem is with the 18th century US Constitution. The US Constitution was drafted before the French Revolution, and it says that a treaty to be endorsed by the United States has to command 67 of 100 senators. That's almost impossible. We have known that it was impossible since the Treaty of Versailles and since the failure of the US Senate to endorse the League of Nations. This problem, this American problem, with their 18th century unrevised constitution, has been visible to us for almost a century. And we're now facing another big test on the climate, which the United States will fail. It will fail it because it is impossible for any president, no matter how successful, to get 67 senators to endorse something that's going to cost their voters money. And this is a problem, a global problem that is in the heart of the US Constitution. It's like the situation in 1911. The British and the Germans were trying to negotiate a naval agreement. And the Germans were willing to negotiate a limitation on their naval building program, in principle, but the Germans had to tell the British, well, sorry, we have a naval law, and we would not be able to get a majority in the Reichstag to change the naval law to enter into an agreement with you to limit our shipbuilding program. As a result, there was no agreement, and we know what happened in 1914. We have the same sort of situation now with the US Constitution, where its Senate has to have 67 senators, which is an impossible target to achieve. The last point I want to express my worry about, and I don't think we are succeeding in being very optimistic, is about the situation of the creation of a Palestinian state. That issue of relations between Israel and the Palestinians is at the heart of our problems with the Muslim world. I was speaking on one occasion to a former finance minister of Afghanistan. He was one of the presidential candidates in the recent elections in Afghanistan for president. And I said to him, well, what's the fundamental problem in relations between people of your faith and people of the West? And he said, well, it's the Palestinian question. That's from Afghanistan. Until that issue of the dispossession of the Palestinians in the 1940s is resolved, there is going to continue to be a problem between the West and the Palestinians. And we saw only last week where the US House of Representatives, by an overwhelming majority, rejected the Goldstone report, which was, came up with adverse findings in regard to Israeli behavior in Gaza, and adverse findings also in regard to the behavior of Hamas in their conflict with Israel in Gaza. Both were condemned by this, as it happens, Jewish South African judge in his report for the United Nations. But this very fair report, which condemned both sides and from which lessons ought to have been drawn about behavior, was simply rejected by 6-1 in the US House of Representatives. So there isn't, I think, that balanced approach to the relationship with the Muslim world that we need to have. And I have to say I was shocked as well to see the result of a referendum in Switzerland, where the idea of people being able to have minarets on mosques was rejected. Well, the European Convention on Human Rights guarantees freedom in public and in private of religious expression. In public and in private, freedom is guaranteed. Well, putting a minaret on a mosque, just as one puts a belfry on a church, is a form of public expression on one's own property of one's religious faith. And yet, the people of Switzerland deny it, not to all religions, but to one religion. That's not viable, in my view, if we want to build the sort of relationship that we need to have with our neighbours to our south and to our east, the people who are of a Muslim faith. That's all I have to say for the moment.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. And from Europe, we are going to now look at America. And for this, I would like to ask Rosalía de Arteaga two things. First one is, since Mr. Rocard and Mr. Bruton spoke, the stress has been placed on the Western countries, the United States and Europe, Australia. In Spain, naturally, Latin America is of great interest to us. And I would like to raise two questions here. One, very specific to you because of your experience with this Latin American politics and your work on matters of the environment, particularly the Amazons. I would like for you to tell us about the importance of this region in the context of the world, which may perhaps go in an accelerated way towards a point of no return in environmental affairs. And I would like your reflection concerning the global situation of the Central and South American continent, if you see that there are advances towards economic progress, and whether a process of democratic strengthening is taking place, or on the contrary, what appear are the old ghosts of the coup d'etat and the chieftains that seem to pop up everywhere. These are the two questions that I would like for you to answer. Thank you very much. Good morning to all of you. I would like to express my gratitude to José Ramón Calvo for his invitation, but also to thank the opportunity of being in this panel, the voice of women and of Latin America, and to say that I have therefore a complex commitment because of the questions as well as because of the situation in which I find myself. I would like to tell you that in this world of uncertainties where we live, if there is something that might characterize our century, it is uncertainty. I frequently tell in meetings of young people that before things were more secure in the family environment, and even in economic affairs, but from some time back this has been destroyed by the economic crisis, the social and even family crisis, and also the concern that we all have, all the inhabitants in this planet, or that we all should have, because of the environment. I will try to be fairly brief, although two very complex matters have been raised that, although they are they have an interaction that may be seen separately. And first of all, I want to focus on Latin America. Latin America, I have qualified as the continent of hope, with multiple situations. This territory that joins history, Western history, but also because of the perspectives for growth, the possibilities for finding new vegetables, new solutions of all kinds, and the fact of being a continent which is a continent with a very young population. But as our moderator said, there are new winds blowing in Latin America that are not very favorable. And I have to express the concern that we all feel concerning the resurgence of regimes, of populistic regimes, which are strongly anti-democratic, and the return to forms of state that, although I agree fully with Minister Rocard, we cannot leave everything in the hands of the private sector, but it is not either good to accumulate everything in public hands, and this is beginning to take place. And I can see it because of what is happening in my own country, but also in other countries, such as the case of Venezuela, where too much is being accumulated in the hands of the state, and the private activity is being limited. And this generates a not very democratic climate. And we could even speak about dictatorships with elections that are very risky for the planet. And these are conflicts that we thought were discarded, unusual purchases of weapons. Latin America is buying more weapons this year than in all the previous years, that really make us have a worry on whether there will be again binational or trinational conflicts, which because of borders and frontiers or economic interests are being agitated again. And it is necessary, I believe, that Europe and the European countries and the United States will look more in detail to Latin America and not just Brazil. Brazil is a great country that I love dearly, and I lived there in the last years, but the existing interrelationship between this global world, and here I am going to enter a little bit into the environmental topic, as it was said before, that when the United States sneezes, the rest of the planet has a cold and sometimes even a pneumonia. We could say that anything that happens anywhere in the planet, and most particularly in such a fragile area as the Amazons, concerns the rest of the continent, and this is interdependent with the Andean region, and it accounts for the fact that the water from the Amazons must necessarily come, not just the water, but the biodiversity of the region, and it sets in serious risk the fact that if the fountains are not taken care of, what may happen in this great basin that was qualified as the main lung of the planet. The Amazons, more than the lung of the planet, is a kind of air conditioning of the world, because it is one of the great moderators of climate in the world, with implications in all continents and in all regions of the world. And thus the importance of looking to Latin America and thinking with a global view, but without leaving aside the viewpoint of identities. And there I necessarily have to dwell on certain subjects that have been mentioned here and which interest the citizens of Latin America: the Palestinian matter and things that have to do with intolerance. And I dare say that the way in which the world will deal with diversity will depend the future of humankind, diversity of human beings, diversity of animals, plants, culture, uses, and religions. The world has been horrified by attacks and situations such as those that took place in the United States and here in Spain, that have a great deal to do with the outbreak of a strong sense of identity, a nationalistic, where the extremes are coming to life again. And this global world appears as the crash against the local, which is the identity and the way in which we conceive and we look at the world and we want that world to be. And I believe that from the association of the global and the local, perhaps advancing criteria such as, I don't know, local, we could perhaps think that we are, as McLuhan said, in a village, but at the same time, that revolution that has placed us in contact with each other, communications, the economic crisis, that show the fragility of some of us by comparison to others, things related to the environment. We know that we're in this global world, but at the same time, the local, that which sets our habits and customs, is something which attempts to arise with more power in front of a tendency to uniformity. And I think that Latin America has a great deal to contribute and a great deal to suffer as well. Sometimes, unfortunately, we do not live according to experiences from others, and these experiences that should be teaching us something are not necessarily taken in that sense. So on the one hand, there is a voice of hope and a voice of concern that has to do with the future of my continent, but at the same time, what this continent means within the global context. I use the term my continent deliberately because we each defend our own way of being, our own things, but this should not prevent that we should look with eyes of tolerance and respect towards the others. What surrounds me is valuable, but what surrounds you is equally valuable for you and for me. And that is where we should hint at some solutions. And we're going to speak not only of crisis or problems, but also of what is the contribution with this enormous weight of talent and the Nobel Award winners and the politicians and the young people. I don't think we can only remain at enumerating the problems. We should go a little further. And this is something I could hint at in a second intervention. Thank you very much. And now to close the panel, it is the turn of the former president of the Canary Islands. And after he finishes his intervention, I invite all of you to take the floor without further requirements. And if the audience wishes to raise some matters, they may do so by sending us these cards that they may fill in. In Europe, when we go towards America, there is a place called the Canary Islands. And this is the place through which we cross and what we went through. And it is perhaps the most sui generis region of the Spanish state for many reasons, because of its place in the ocean and this experience of having directed such a community that is like a bridge, a point of contact, even linguistically speaking, because I have always been surprised when I go to Latin America that they speak like they do in the Canary Islands, because the Venezuelans do so. But I would like to have a view towards this whole, and also something which is the aspect of energy. One of the elements about this crisis that is being discussed so much is the matter of energy. And Europe and Spain, in this sense, is working and developing clean alternative energies. But the question could be, those energies that we want so much, that we try to promote, are they valid perhaps for those developing countries? Because it is true also that they are very expensive. So I would like some reflection on your part on all this. Yes, yes. In the first place, I would like to congratulate José Ramón Calvo because he was the creator of the Campus of Excellence. And when I was chairing the government of the Canary Islands, he happened to have this idea, and he's made a tremendous effort in order to maintain all these people and these ideas, and try to contribute something to the world that is something that is global and local. And all the participants have said that we find ourselves in a crisis. Well, I would like to say that in the last 20 years, many things have happened. We've gone from the politics of the large blocs, the fall of the Berlin Wall, a bipolar world where a series of countries attempted to play a political and economic role that was highly polarized, to a world that is practically unipolar, with politics set by the United States, those of economic policies, policies of security, and we have this world in which the number of important countries, China, Brazil, is getting larger, Europe, the United States, Russia, and they're beginning to play important political roles, and it seems that we can live through a period of great agreements, and when one organized from a small place in an archipelago, which were the politics that one should carry out, we saw which were the world politics, and in that reference you try to place the politics of a local community that is in Europe, that is, well, that is located closer to the African continent. 90 miles is the distance from Africa, but with an enormous connection with America, because of all those who have migrated to all of America. We have many people who continue maintaining their family bonds, and in the world of new technologies and transportation, it is no longer that migration in which you left and never came back. As a consequence of this globalization, I believe it is important nonetheless to maintain the local characteristics of the peoples. And a consequence of this situation is that we are immersed with other parameters, such as in a financial crisis of the Western world rather than of the rest of the world. But if we see the countries that have progressed with freedom, democracy, justice, security, freedom of markets, because the fact that the market has failed means that the rules that we have set are not enough, but it doesn't mean that the market is not the basis for these democratic countries in the last 20 years. And therefore it seems to me very important in the analysis that we make to have hope. And I believe that things will tend to sort themselves out, and which is my concern, that we see things from a small archipelago, that first of all, to politics, to the financial situation, to everything we have to add ethics and values. And this is something that will make us progress in the oncoming years. But apart from this, we are concerned by the fact that the economic crisis entails changes of politics, the politics of the millennium for the development of a continent such as Africa. A continent which in the last 6 or 7 years, if you take the economic parameters, the social parameters, 53% of the inhabitants of Africa don't have drinking water. And this is the main cause of all the diseases they suffer, and the cause for the fact that their life expectancy is around 50 years instead of 75. But technologically, everything has been already developed. Will we be able to help Africa to have 100% drinking water, fresh water for their inhabitants? Africa, which is one of the great suppliers of fuel in the world to produce energy, may they have the necessary energy to develop, or will the wealthier countries be the ones that will not use the more expensive energies, and we tend to go to the cheapest one, where what is normal is that the developed countries and the large world economies will pull from the alternative energies because they have double or 3 or 4 times the price that you can get from nuclear energy or those derived from fuel. And we leave this space to the developing countries so that they could have a cheaper energy until they manage to increase their standards of living and therefore the capacity to generate a better economy. Is the world going to continue maintaining these politics of aid? And is this 0.7 of the GDP continuing to be the objective, or is the crisis going to reduce this collaboration? This is happening in Spain itself. When we speak in Spain about a system of autonomic financing, which is supposed to be highly solidary, so that the rights of individuals will be paramount, what starts to be discussed is if the wealthier regions, what they should do is forge ahead and use all the resources generated. So the crisis raises the fact that the politics that are focused to change the world into a more fairer and solidary world may continue to be maintained. Energy policies adapted to these circumstances, politics for water, the great social and educational and health policies in these countries in order to maintain equal opportunities, and the policies for cooperation with Latin America, that is now becoming an engine with countries such as Brazil, but obviously it is necessary to agglutinate around them democratic systems. I think that all these matters are the ones that, from the view that we may have from a remote, small archipelago, immersed nonetheless in the Atlantic Ocean, where we see the planes fly over us from Europe to America, or from Europe to Africa, but where in fact very little remains in our region. The map of communications, air, maritime communications, where we see where they are concentrated. They're concentrated in the north of Europe or in the north of America, and there are very few connections with the Latin American and African world, but that is where a great part of the world lives. So I've been promoting a foundation that we have created in Fernando de Soto to try to create policies adapted to Africa, where they can develop a market, but not a free market that will be shattering, but a social regulated market that will do inclusive policies, that the poor may advance little by little, that there will be town planning policies. And I look at Africa constantly because we are really concerned by the development of Africa, and I believe that what we have to require right now is that the crisis will not mask the development in the more needy continents. Well, now, after this round of interventions, we give rise to what will be, I hope, an open discussion between the members of the panel and the audience also, if they wish to ask a question. And now it is all of you who have the floor. If you like, we can start from here. Well, some concepts were hinted at, some ideas, which I think we have to go more in depth into. On my part, I spoke about Latin America, and in passing, I touched the subject of the Amazons because I love them. I was Secretary General of the Organization for Amazonic Cooperation, and there were 7 million square kilometers on the fragile shoulders of a woman. 20% of the fresh water of the planet and the highest biodiversity of the planet. I do not wish to sound presumptuous, but a Finnish expert on the Amazon said some time ago that in 1 hectare of the jungle of the Amazons there is more biodiversity than in the whole of the European continent. This gives us an idea of what we're talking about, a world that is anguished with the problem of the water supply, with biodiversity. In October, I had the chance to participate with Dr. Luc Montagnier, also a Nobel Award winner. He spoke about the AIDS virus. And I was speaking on everything related to biodiversity because the scientific knowledge, the traditional knowledge, the experimentation, the empirical knowledge, everything related to praxis. And of course, these substances that sometimes we do away with because the pressure of China to have more raw material, the soybean, for example, is very important, and it accounts for clearing up square kilometers of jungle, so that you will get an idea. Just in the year 2005 of the Amazon jungle in Brazil were burned 25,000 square kilometers, and they were burned. I'm not talking about other illegalities in the region, so this only on the Brazilian territory. So if we consider that there is very little that remains in the planet of these continuous jungles, and the greatest case is the Amazon, the future is more concerning, not just for the 30 million inhabitants that live in the continental region of the Amazons, because it is also a myth. It is sometimes considered the Amazons as an empty space, interesting but empty. There's no people. Yes, there are people who want to live well. They want a sustainable development, and therefore the pressure of the population is also important. So in view of these demands of the planet, which would be the role, and here there is also a question for the developed world, which is the role of the Amazons, of the region. Somebody spoke about making the Amazons international. To this, the former Minister of Education of Brazil said, well, if they internationalize the Amazon, also the pyramids of Egypt and so on, a whole series of things in the world that belong to humanity, but until that happens, no. The Amazons are ours, and but we also have this responsibility towards the planet. So what would be the role of the various continents within this global world where technology appears to overflow, and where the knowledge is so great that the obsolescence of technology is incredible? What we use one day is obsolete the next day. Communications are incredible. But which is the role of these original peoples? Which is the role that continents such as Latin America are playing, including Brazil with all its contrasts and potentials? Where are we going? Towards a more polarized world? Because, and here what was mentioned, in these 20 years many things have happened. From a bipolar world we went to a unipolar world, and now we're returning to a multipolar world with a great complexity. People don't know how to act, nor even where to deposit their limited savings. They don't know if their taxes, as was said here, are going to be used in fraudulent investments, and the world of drugs is threatening the planet as well. And all this implies, on the one hand, that we have to perhaps return to the values which are important, those that human beings want to become a reality with a whole series of aspirations and wishes, but knowing that, and here is the great challenge, that we have to give value to what others are doing as well. And I insist on returning to a local view, not only the global world that we have heard about from the Americans and the Anglo-Saxons, and not just this unification of the world, but of the local. This impact that we, as diverse, multi-ethnic, multilingual human beings, want to live in this world. And there lies the great challenge, and I think we could there hint at some solution. A plural locality, this world of technology, of computers, of the global village, with our own identities.
¿Alguna cuestión más?
Any further questions? I would like to ask something. I have seen you terribly pessimistic on the way out of the crisis. You have mentioned something that has surprised me about these international false plot to fool us about the crisis. Are the banks lying to us? Well, of course. Well, this term is that we are in a period of stagnation, and after all, you, Mr. Moderator, are a journalist. After a recession and a stagnation, is it usual, according to the definition we have of the term, to speak about recovery when we announce a possibility for development of a given economy of 0.6%. And I have received from my teachers in the university, and I tried to be an honest politician and not to use terms in order to create misunderstandings. I think that recovery means growth, and when we speak of these, then everybody will have a chance, of course, to be delighted with these small recoveries of 0.4%, and it is always better by comparison to the aggressive growth, because we have seen that the GDP has gone down almost everywhere. So there's 0.6% that recovers 1/emptieth part of the growth lost. Well, it is always better. But we have to present all the reports on this. But I do not give up this statement that with similar growth, of course, the unemployment will not decrease. And if you have used the term crisis for something, frequently it is because of the seriousness of unemployment, and it is still growing. And this recovery, in inverted commas, 0.6%, will continue to increase. So this is one first point. And you mentioned the Balkan states, marvelous countries that have had dreadful wars over the last 20 years. I could say that this is one of the regions where the economic crisis we are suffering is having more of an effect, because these are regions to be rebuilt because of the disasters of the war, and the situation is not very good. Slovenia, which was the first country to enter into NATO and into the Euro region, is more solid than the others and those of old Yugoslavia, because it is more structured and it has always exported and it has taken the shock of the crisis better. Politically, the most important country in the area is Serbia, that is having a very delicate evolution. This country, under various forms, has gone too far with its nationalism or its national pride. I have a quote of Jean Jaurès, who said that patriotism is the love of your own, and nationalism is the hate of others. And the Germany of the time of Hitler gave us this tragic spectacle of people who went crazy because of an excess of national pride. The genocide, the massacre, that took place in the years 40-41 was related to a project of the Great Serbia. And the Serbians were the more numerous, and they were fighters, and they had the impression that history had cut their wings, and they didn't get the space that they deserved. And in the universities, and you have to remember that they spoke about the Great Serbia, and the document was approved by the Academy of Sciences of Serbia. This is a document of an intellectual origin. And there they started the conquest of the neighboring countries. And having said this, the politicians, the new political parties came into being in Serbia that tried to put nationalism in their place, but this was extremely difficult. And in general, this is a system in which you lose the elections. And we have here close to us a representation of Latin America, not just Argentina, but Venezuela. This is a continent that has known also the excesses of national pride. And Serbia, I hope, will become wiser and will Milosevic, this great war criminal, well, the spirit should prepare themselves to the idea that Slovenia or Serbia might join the European Union like Slovenia, and in this case, Croatia as well has responsibilities in the seriousness of these circumstances and this explosion, but to a lesser extent. And in fact, we all have the feeling that all these countries will remain isolated. Each will have their state, their national pride, and remain isolated. And they even want a vengeance. And it is true that if everybody adheres to the European Union, the war technically would be impossible. I believe that the European Union politically is dead, but economically it is an aggregate of nations that plays with the same rules of the game. And the fact of developing together our economies creates duties for reconciliation that are going very well. Not only the French and the German there as partners, but the French and the Germans is like the Serbians and the Bosnians. The French and the Germans who have fought 3 times in 25 years and who have been at war for 500, and they have an equal number of, well, there is a doubt on who has killed more people from the other side. It's like the Hutus and the Tutsis. And this has represented an enormous progress in the art of killing, but not a fabulous progress in feelings. But managed together, first of all, within the Association for Coal and Steel, and they have learned to live together, and now the French and the Germans, they are what I believe, like my friend Jean Mouton, and I don't know whether he believes it as well, but what John Halm said, Nobel Prize for Peace from Northern Ireland, who was a colleague as a European well, unless we had not entered Europe, there would not have been this progress in the relations between the Catholics and the Protestants in Northern Ireland. So it is an excellent system for reconciling people. And there were perhaps 2 strong frictions between Spain and Portugal. Well, not 2 strong frictions, but they were not the best of friends. Each of their countries went their own way. And it is good for them to now be within the European Union. And then, miracle, the Germans and the Poles are now in a process of reconciliation. So my message is that we have to be willing to accept the arrival of Bosnia, of Croatia. Bosnia is a country that doesn't manage to have a state because there are 3 communities: the Serbs, the Croats, and the Albanese, and the Muslims. And Bosnia requires the stability and the reconciliation of the procedures of the European Union, and I think that we committed a mistake in not wanting to reach these unanimous agreements. They have not developed a common army. Whenever the European Union decides to contribute to the peace, they want to discuss the price and the volume, and Europe has almost been shattered by the declarations of war upon Iraq by President Bush, and the art of living together produces civilization. And this is why we should give them a welcome, including Serbia and Montenegro, and of course Albania, that will come later, and we will help it to come out of this situation of poverty. It is a country massacred by wars and communism, and we have to give them their chance. And in spite of the official position of the President of the French Republic, I am an advocate of Turkey within the European Union, and in passing I would like to say that Spain, neither in its leaders nor in the surveys have they gone against this. I think that we have to have Turkey within the European Union because it has kept a situation of balance and friendship between Israel and Palestine, and because it is in a period in which it is signing an agreement with Armenia and has set up a commission of historians to say really what happened and whether there was this genocide or not, and this massacre, and this would be a reconciliation between Turkey and Armenia. Turkey has just accepted the return to the country of about 20 clandestine militants, Kurdish militants, who had chosen this line of insurrection. And now they have been accepted with the agreement of the secret services and of diplomacy. So Turkey has taken decisive steps, and it would be stronger if it belonged to the European Union, because the European Union has this pacifying effect upon the region, and this would prevent a possibility that we will not be able to live together peacefully with the Muslims. Thank you very much for your question. Mr. Rocard said that our perspectives in Spain are of recession, not of a recovery of 0.6%. We wish we had it. And concerning unemployment, those of us who are here, we know that we are number one here. We're really the champions in unemployment in Europe. And in fact, we cannot really be optimistic about this, because some will now start recovering a little bit, and we don't see clearly the possibility still of creating work and jobs. I believe that Mr. Bruton would like to say something.
Rosalía was saying about the problem of the Amazon. And it seems to me it's not realistic to expect the Brazilians not to use the resources of the Amazon to grow their economy unless they are compensated in some other way. They have to receive money to compensate them for not using their own territory. And this creates, I think, the problem of creating a global fund that would be large enough to compensate Brazil for preserving this air conditioning system of the world. And this brings us to the fundamental question that we're facing in the world today. We have created a world that is completely interdependent. We are all completely interdependent on one another. Even in the center of Africa, they're affected by things that are happening, pollution that's created in Pittsburgh or somewhere like that. We have created an interdependent world, but we have no system for governing the world democratically and legitimately. And I think you're right in saying that we're moving from a unipolar world into a multipolar world. But a multipolar world is much more dangerous, actually, than a unipolar world. Because in a unipolar world, at least the great power can make decisions. Sometimes they will make bad decisions, like the decision to invade Iraq, but at least they can make decisions. But in a multipolar world, nobody is enabled to make decisions. And the international institutions that we established in the wake of the Second World War, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, all of these organizations need to be radically reformed. The United Nations Security Council overrepresents Europe. The International Monetary Fund overrepresents some other parts of the world as well, including Europe. But there is no sign that we here in Europe, who are, I'm proud to say, we are the pioneers of finding ways of governing globalization. We are doing it within Europe through the European Union, which is the only multinational organization in the world that actually is a democracy, the only multinational organization with an elected parliament. But even though we are pioneers, if you like, of governing globalization within Europe, we are still selfishly insisting that Britain will hang on to its seat on the UN Security Council, that France will hang on to its seat on the UN Security Council. We all want to preserve our quotas and our votes in the International Monetary Fund, and we're not prepared to give the sort of leadership that we should be giving. Gordon Brown recently also suggested that the Tobin tax should be reintroduced as a means of getting the banks to contribute on every transaction towards a fund that could be used to rescue the banks whenever the banks next need to be rescued. He was laughed out of court by all of the other people who heard this speech when he made it in, I think it was St. Andrews about 2 weeks ago. The other finance ministers weren't interested in this idea at all. Now, I think we have got to be prepared to be courageous and confront nationalism in our own countries to create a global order. If we don't, then globalization will have to be dismantled. And we will have to go back to our individual, much poorer, isolated national realities. That would be a much poorer, a much more warlike world. But I think we have gone, and I take the European Union as an example, we have looked to the other side of the river. We have gone halfway into the river, and now we're hesitating about going the rest of the journey. For example, we've created a single European currency. We've created a single financial market, but we don't have a European tax base that could be used to provide funds to regulate and, if necessary, rescue the financial market that we have created and our single currency that we have created. In other words, we have willed the object without willing the means to achieve the object. We're halfway across the river, and we're not sure whether we want to go the rest of the journey or whether we want to run back to the safety of the shore from which we originally came. My sense of the world that we're in today is that it is too late to think of going back to the shore that we originally came from. And it is ironic, sorry to any Swiss people who may be here, if I were to go back to Switzerland, it is ironic that the country that has probably profited most from globalization, Switzerland with its great banking sector, which has financed globalization all over the world, is the country that seems to be leading the way now in wanting to go back to some idea of a single culture world where other cultures, like the Muslim culture, are simply to be made invisible. That type of sort of nostalgia for an imagined past, and indeed it is an imagined past. It's probably a past that never fully existed. The ideal of a completely harmonious Christian Europe. Well, I think if you lived in the 17th century or in the 12th century, you'd probably realize that it wasn't so harmonious even then. But the idea that in the 21st century we can recreate it by simply banishing all signs of diversity, it makes no sense. So we need, I think, not just at the level of values, here I agree with the former president of Ecuador, we need values, but we also need instruments of power, global instruments of power to govern globalization democratically. And I think, I'll stop on this, I think the European Union is the model. It's not a political failure. It's a political project under construction, and there are a few design flaws in it, and we need maybe to strengthen some of the foundations. But it's not a political failure. What's missing is courage. And I think we've seen, particularly in the recent use that has been made of the new powers of the Lisbon Treaty, a lot of signs of returning to the bad old national power politics, people saying, we did better than you, we got a better portfolio than your country got, and all these battles for national prestige that seem to be going on around the appointment of commissioners and appointment of people to top jobs in Europe. Please, that's the rhetoric of the 19th century, those battles of national prestige. Europe is only 7% of the world's population. We're enjoying somewhere in the region of 30% of the world's wealth. Our population is declining. The idea that Europe can be reduced to battles for prestige between country A and country B, we're only very small players in a very, very big world, we Europeans. And I think we need to wise up and unite rather than be looking to play games at one another's expense.
Bueno, tengo muchísimas preguntas de...
I have many questions from the audience. Well, I wanted to ask the first one, but first a reflection, which I make mine as well. It is surprising that in a vision, as I have tried to give you the world crisis, systematically we mention the United States, China, very little, and not at all India. For example, we have this view of being only fixed on this. So while Michel Rocard gets ready, I will give the floor to Martín that has a very specific question here. What do you think of the fact that the Spanish boats leave the Canary Islands and go towards Sahrawi waters, and we now have the problem in Lanzarote of these activists who's on a strike, on a hunger strike? No puedo, luego te llamo. And I wanted to speak about this development of the global, I think we all agree with globalization, because the new technologies lead us there, but the new technologies are reached by only 1/3 of the population. And even for the more elementary problems, such as those of having fresh water or the necessary energy in order to organize themselves as a society and improve their quality of life. I believe that the serious problem is, as we speak of a global world, but there are regions in the world that have all the GDP, and there are wealthy and poor regions, And we will only have a global world if we go to a policy of equality. And for this, we may need financial tools which will be capable of helping democracy, freedoms, development, education, health, markets, with all respect to develop. And this has to be a bet of the world that has the resources to the one that doesn't have it. And there, of course, is a greater space of freedom and development in this world of 500 million. But there is also a role for the South-South relations. I'm quite sure that Chile and Argentina have to play a role in the development of Africa, which is also in the South, and we have to find mechanisms that will allow us this transfer so that this multipolar world will be able to have the instruments of power and the financial instruments to change. But the world has progressed always, advancing a little, then falling back again, and I believe we will continue to progress. We are going to build a world. Well, clearly, we spoke about the Spanish crisis. I am of those that believes that it will take longer to come out of it, because the Canary Islands are like a small lab. We, in the year 2003 thought that we couldn't continue with the real estate sector as it was, and there was a law passed to see how we could continue growing without the engine of construction, because we knew we could not have a maintained growth. And this in Spain has we have almost reached 14% of the GDP, when in Germany it is 6 or 7. And this we will have to lose in the case of the Canary Islands, even more so. And this is why we have 26% unemployment. And all this is going to involve us, and we have to accept the fact that we have to correct our policies at regional levels, European policies and world policies. But I have the hope, and I believe we have to create the climate so that the large ones will have to reach an agreement, and it's not only the United States, India, China, Brazil, these great world powers, Japan, that have to set the path for these technologies, for this development, to reach the rest of the world. And within Europe, the policies to advance of those who believe that the Treaty of Lisbon has taken a great effort, but it finally has been passed. But I believe that the same thing will happen in the world. And concerning the problem of the Sahara, this is a very complicated situation. We have seen the problem of the kidnapping and what Al-Qaeda has to do in all the area of the Sahel. And on the other hand, the Sahrawi population has the right to hold a referendum. And this was backed by the United Nations, and Morocco is contrary to this. And 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I went to the United States to talk to Baker, who was the mediator in the Sahrawi conflict. at the time, and when I entered his institute in Houston and I asked, well, I come to hear your opinion of what will happen in the Sahara, because it is very important for us to contribute to a path of peace and progress in the area, and also security. And the answer he gave me was, we cannot do anything, nothing. We don't think anything is going to happen. And he had been negotiating for 2 months and he had failed, and the next month he presented his resignation. So we have to see whether the policies of Obama seem to have shown a certain commitment with the negotiating table that leads us to such idealistic positions, so praiseworthy, which show the very important values. There is a Saharan area which is a permanent source of conflict, and there is wealth and a solution to this conflict that should be looked for at world level. And we wanted to know if in the Canaries we could organize some of the meetings with the people politically responsible of the Polisario, trying to see whether we could open a dialogue. And in that meeting at the end, the Polisario did not attend. But these are some of those great conflicts to be solved in the world. And these are generations lost. Mr. Rocard, before you take the floor for the question I have asked you, I have a whole battery of questions here for you. And I ask you to be brief. The one related to this: how do you value the greater participation of countries in fora such as the G20 or Davos? Do you believe it is positive that these countries will tend to incorporate? And then there is a question that the developing countries might join this economic discussion forum. Another question asked is they rather ask you for advice. What advice can you give Spain to come out of the crisis quicker? Because our impression is that we're going to be the last ones out of the crisis in Europe. Will we see soon the end of the tunnel? And finally, on something peculiar to your country, what about this identity debate, the French identity, the French national identity? What debate? The debate on the national French identity. A very brief comment on each of them, because we have to finish. So the essential question I had raised is that we continue talking about the United States and we don't speak of China or India or Brazil. Well, these are too many questions to finish. I don't wish to approach the debate on the national aspects, because it would take too long. I would like to say that France, because of the violence of its history and because of the fact that it has been the first country in Europe to enter into a serious demographic depression, to be the only country in Europe for 1 century that was a country of immigration. And then I am a Protestant, and this represents only 1% of the French, so it is not representative. But 14th of July, there was a meeting of the Constituent Assembly, and most of this assembly was Catholic. And the history of France is marvelous, but the Protestants, the Jews, and the actors, and the colored people became citizens in this meeting in 1789, and there were many Spaniards between the 2 world wars that had migrated, particularly after the Spanish Civil War, and they're all now French citizens. And between the wars, we had enormous immigration from Poland and Italy, very badly treated by the press and the Belgians, and they spoke worse about them than of the Belgians, or that they speak of the black or of the Muslim now. So the French identity is marked by a will to live together, and this is shared a little bit by everyone. And the only thing that is not possible is to say, well, we're going to stop this continuous movement. This would seem to me dangerous, but I'm not going to say anything else. There was a question which I find has not been fully answered about the reasons for the crisis in Spain, and I'm going to be forced to go back to the general expression of the crisis only in 5 minutes, don't worry. But there is a general deterioration of the economy, as in all other cases. But the fact is that the banking system had overdeveloped the real estate sector and the mortgages, and therefore you were in a more fragile situation, and the speculation on real estate. And this is why you have been hit more seriously than France or Germany. And afterwards, returning to the crisis in general, I believe that there is something concerning the crisis. To speak about Brazil or India, well, it is true. Well, we don't talk about it because they're not in crisis, really. What happens as an explanation is that there is a deviation from the regulations of the capitalism in developed countries, which are the United States and Europe. And this happens at a time when, in about 15 years, China has made miracles and has had a growth of its GDP, or 2-digit growth, for 15 years. And the average income has more than of the average Chinese household has more than doubled, and they went from 0.0% of the world trade 30 years ago, and now only China represents 7% of the world trade, and it is the greatest exporter and the greatest importer of coal and I'm not going to give more figures. And China has received the economic crisis, in which we believe only through a slowing down of its exports that she was selling to us and to the United States mostly. And in China, the exports towards the United States have been reduced dramatically. And I also think that the recession is a stagnation of whether it is 0.6 or not 0.6. This doesn't change the GDP. And in China, with so many million inhabitants, with a clearly formulated strategy to go slowly in their internal growth and to do it through exports. Why? Because China is an urban civilization, and there are 800 million of people in the countryside who live with $2 or $3 a day. They're very poor, 800 million. And China knows if the speed of development changed suddenly, well, it is the members of the party who are speaking of people that want to settle this property of the land, and China is today raising the question of whether it can focus its growth upon its domestic economy through the income of these farmers, or whether it should be something else. And it goes less fast with somewhat better domestic balance, and it plays this role of sustaining the world economy, but it is not in crisis, and neither Brazil, because its mechanisms are different. And on the heart of the crisis, well, there is one first statement. The very great difficulty of the crisis today is the lack of agreement between the scientists of the economy and the silence of most people concerning the macroeconomic crisis. Why? Because the macroeconomic crisis opens a controversy that is going to give rise to considerable interests. And what happened? We have spoke about the financial defeat and this banking madness in order to try to keep this continuity, and this has hit economies that were anemic and tired. And what happens is, a practical aspect is that in these marvelous years 45, 75, all developed countries were in a situation of rapid growth, regular rapid growth, without any financial crisis in 30 years, and they all had full employment, even Spain, at the time fascist Spain. And what happened? What happened was that there was a great deal of social security which stabilized the system. Secondly, the policies followed tried to deal with the fluctuations, and besides there were high salaries. And should I stop here? Well, I will stop. Well, two more sentences. A policy of high salaries, a high purchasing power, and now the shareholders have entered into hedge funds, and they have requested a higher dividend, and there has been a very rapid increase of unemployment and of the poor and of precarious jobs, and the GDP, the part of salaries, has 10% less than what it was 30 years ago. And why? They don't dare say it, because this is the result of the doctrine of Mr. Milton Friedman that found that this was very good, because he didn't want to say it, because in order to recover that, we have to go to back to the policy of high salaries. So it is a problem of conflict, of battles, and there has to be a change of doctrine. They have to recognize that the dominating doctrine was false, and also the governments should agree with the entrepreneurs to raise the salaries, because the salaried workers represent 80% of the world population, and the Spanish case is within all this. Thank you very much. There could be many other questions. So we consider that we will here adjourn. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm sorry if we have not been able to answer all your questions.